Okay, we're going to make a start. Thank you, everybody, for being here. You already know that this session is about digital ID, and there are a couple of reasons why that's a really interesting subject to be talking about at IDS. One of those reasons is that we're just in the digital cluster as part of our work with the African Digital Rights Network. We're just about to start a one-year process of documenting and analyzing biometric digital ID in 10 African countries. So that dovetails very nicely with this piece of work. And the other reason is because of the work of the International Tax and Development Center here at IDS, who are now starting the second phase of their work on digital public infrastructure. And we'll come back and talk about that, and hopefully we'll be able to have a conversation about it. So it's a great time to be talking about the role of digital ID in international development. And fortunately, we have two of the most distinguished scholars working on exactly that issue to talk to you today. So Silvia Masiero is here to talk about her new book, Unfair ID. And Silvia is an associate professor at the University of Oslo. She's editor-in-chief of the journal IT for Development. She's also chair of the IFIP 9.4 working group on digital technology for development, and a senior editor at the Electronic Journal of Information Systems in Developing Countries. Eminently qualified. And after Silvia makes a presentation about her book, we're also fortunate to have Eve Hayes de Calaf, who will act as a discussant, I think we called it. So she'll respond to the presentation after Silvia's opening remarks. And Eve is a research fellow at the Institute of Historical Research, which is part of the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. And she, in 2022, was the author of this book on legal identity, race and belonging in the Dominican Republic. And we did a podcast for Between the Lines, the IDS podcast series, when that book was launched. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Silvia to talk about the book.
Splendid. So it's a lot of emotion to be here. So first of all, big thanks, Tony, for organizing a splendid event. I love coming here. I can make very little mystery of it. And like Tony said, I'm Silvia. I'm an associate prof at the University of Oslo. So that's in Norway, but this has been my home country for 12 years. So coming back to the UK, seeing my friends, seeing Tony, Eve, Caroline in the audience, Grace in the audience. So connections of a very long time is really coming, in a way, is coming home. So I'm twice as grateful for making this possible, and twice as grateful to have Eve, whose book, Legal Identity, Race and Belonging in the Dominican Republic, has been a massive inspiration for Unfair ID. So I was looking at them now and joking that they look very much like sister books in a way. But yeah, so it's an honor to be able, I think I titled this presentation Unfair ID, which is my book, Digital Identity from Injustice to Resistance. Disclaimer, the book doesn't really have a subtitle because I didn't know where to put it. No, okay, not only for that reason, but because I just wanted to pass this message of let's examine, let's dissect scientifically how data injustices is something I'm gonna get in 5 minutes can be produced in the ID world and what can be done about it. So if there was a subtitle, it will be this journey perspective, this journey from injustice to resistance that the book makes. Those who know me know this already, but I really like doing things in a very interactive way. So I think I'll give you a brief, I think we agreed on some 15, 20 Italian minutes. Okay, Italian minutes, we finish tomorrow now. I'll give a brief intro to the book, and then we have the discussants intervention from Eve. And I'd really love to take this occasion also a warm welcome to those of you online, and big thanks to technical assistants for making this possible. So I'd like to do this in the most conversational way possible. So yeah, like I said, this book is a journey to begin with. It's, I think you also have a sort of QR code to get more details on on how to actually access the book. Another way to access the book is if you want to read the book and you would like a PDF, let me know. That's simple. I'm very keen to have like the possibility of making the text accessible to friends and colleagues. I'd really like. I really see this book as the beginning rather than the end of a conversation. Like I said, it's a journey in 3 sections. A first one on identity, so essentially the moment, what happens, so digital identity. So there's many ways to conceive this term that we use a lot. In Unfair ID, I see digital identity in a way as the conversion of identities into machine-readable data that enables and, as we will see, disables many operations. A second section is centered on injustice, and as we're going to see in a minute, in a way that's the core contribution on the book develops a data justice framework to understand unfairness in digital ID. Quick show of hands, has anyone heard this expression, data justice? See you a lot because I bombard you with that. Anyone else? Some of you have. Okay, so it's something that we will use a lot today. So by data justice, here I quote the work by Lynette Taylor from the University of Tilburg, and we basically mean fairness in 3 things: how people are visualized, represented, and treated. Treatment is crucial, not through their production of digital data. So I try to develop a framework to make sense of, to put it very bluntly, what can go wrong when our identities are digitalized. And the last 2 chapters, so little spoiler, it has a happy ending. Somewhere I think I say it's a hymn to hope, this book. So to the point that one says, I think we had a similar conversation in Oxford 2 days ago, and I think one question was, but how much scientific ground there is to hope here? I mean, with all this despair. Maybe that's a question that we can discuss today. But the book really wants to understand unfairness in order to imagine forms of fairness. That's in a way, the positive message that the book carries. My book is a storybook. So a storybook that builds a lot on what has been my ethnographic work. So when I don't write books, I conduct a lot of research on anti-poverty programs. That was, in a way, briefly to tell you my story, also how I entered the domain of digital identity. I wasn't a digital ID researcher. I wasn't even an ID researcher. I have a master's in development management from the LSE. And during my master's studies, so we're talking the beauty of 15 years ago, because time flies, I became very interested in this fabric called anti-poverty programs, broad term to identify all programs, mainly social welfare, that seek to repair poverty-related injustices. The main program I work on is in the south of India. Anyone from India? Some of you. Can I ask you, from where are you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you? Tamil Nadu. And you? And you're from Delhi. Splendid. So it's my research is mainly in 2 other states, Kerala and Karnataka. That's also how I met you, Grace. And so a lot of my research is on a program called the Public Distribution System, or PDS. That's, to put it in a nutshell, a food distribution program, redistribution internal to the country, where people, so people below the poverty line, in a nutshell, can access food commodities at highly subsidized prices through what you see over there. They are shops called ration shops. They are small shops where people, upon identification and recognition as below the poverty line, can receive some food commodities. What does this have to do with ID? This is a program that became eminently biometric. So if you see the second picture over here, a person is being recognized through their fingerprint. On the other side of the screen, two things are happening. So one, the person is hopefully being recognized for who they are. So is Silvia who she claims to be? So that happens through the reading of biological data, in this case a fingerprint. Doesn't have to be a fingerprint, is a bit different in Tamil Nadu, for example, as we were discussing with Grace, where there is a smart card that is punched into the system. But the second thing that is happening is that the person, the ration dealer behind the computer, is also seen to what this person is entitled. So person X, because of their poverty status, is entitled to this quantity of rice, this quantity of sugar, this quantity of other goods. So one can say, put in my development studies hat, I understand that several of you are studying development, which is not surprising, with this an Institute of Development Studies. Put in my development management hat, one can say, but this is splendid, no? So you can exclude all the persons that are not entitled to a certain program and include biometrically all those who are entitled. Beautiful, no? No. So essentially, what can possibly go wrong? And this is, in a way, the starting point of unfair ID. And this is me, this is the hardest part in this brief presentation, because it sort of tries to illuminate the many streams of literature that problematize this. I would, for the sake of time, reduce it to two streams of literature. One of them centered on when inclusion of entitled people essentially doesn't work out and ends up denying very essential rights. I work on food, which is a very essential right. This is also where Yves' book falls. So Yves wrote a book on, and I hope to do justice to your work, essentially on where an even more fundamental right, the right to citizenship, ends up being blocked, being denied, because you study populations, I think, largely, but not only, of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic, whose access to ID is blocked, to even renewal of their ID is blocked. So it's a very strong stream of literature. It, in a way, problematizes this development logic, development orthodoxy of ID. And there is also a second, we have Tony here, and your work on surveillance in Africa. So the whole stream of work on surveillance, on how ID can, in a way, lead not only to perverse outcomes, to very extreme outcomes, the very giving out of identities, for example, in refugee management. So there's plenty of evidence here. There's a splendid report by the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University. There's a quite iconic title. It's called Paving a Digital Road to Hell. Sorry to bring sadness in this presentation. And it's a report that directly connects violations of human rights to the implementation of centralized digital identity programs. So it's a paradox, isn't it? Because we have these programs that are built in a way with this development orthodoxy, and then empirical research says that. It doesn't say like that the orthodoxy is happening. So if I had to pin down a central question that inspired this book, it would be this one. So we are looking at very harmful outcomes. Yves' work, Tony's work, the work more at large on exclusions from social welfare. How are harmful outcomes of digital ID produced? One could have approached this question in many ways. What I do, as I mentioned in the intro, is I seek to develop a data justice framework to understand ID injustice. So, yeah, like I said, I see data justice very much with this triple notion of data visualization, representation, and treatment. And the framework I develop in the book, so this is a snapshot of the 3 central empirical chapters. I should mention builds on my work on India's PDS. In 2019, with Shomo Das from Emilion University, we wrote a paper called Data Fine Anti-Poverty Programs, where an early version of the framework was presented. That was built on our fieldwork on India's PDS that is being made biometric by the largest biometric infrastructure in the world that goes by the name of Aadhaar, and which I think means foundation, no, in several Indian languages. So a foundation to build different forms of access. The book, in a way, finds three main ways, and I don't want to conceive this as exhaustive, but as one way to see how harmful outcomes can be produced. One whole family of outcomes, and one that costed me a substantial work in a field that is not mine, that is the legal field. Any lawyers here? Lawyers, scholars of law? Okay, no, it is where I really had to take my human rights books and study. Is what in the book we refer to as legal injustice. And by legal injustice, I essentially mean the fact that a universal right, citizenship in the case of Eve, food in my case, is not universal anymore because it becomes conditional to the fact that the digital infrastructure works. Like in the case of the PDS, I think, I'm speaking of Karnataka here, so again, southern Indian states, one thing that we witness often is families queuing together at the ration shop so that maybe one person in the family is able to identify. This varies a lot state by state. We were discussing that, Grace. But one thing that I think several states have in common, definitely the two states that I study, is that after 3 attempts, the person is invited to come back another day for a very vital ration of food. So then I think this idea of conditionality, so conditionality of universal rights to well-functioning digital ID. And this is where I saw the legal side of programs incriminating a bit. I must also say, and this is maybe something we can discuss, I think in digital ID, a lot of the literature on injustice is on this, is on exclusion. I think we can, Eve might agree or not here, but I think a substantial block of our community works on exclusion. What the book says is a bit does not problematize the fact that exclusion is a problem, but says, attention, it is a bit deeper, the problem. In a way, I see these layers as a sort of iceberg because exclusion is there, but it's a tip of an iceberg, you know? Because, for example, I have a whole chapter here in which we talk about informational injustice. So what is informational injustice? Is in many ways broadly injustice and obscuration of what happens to data in the moment in which they are processed digitally. A lot of the people I speak to, again, in the context of India's public distribution system, are not in the position to meaningfully inquire what happens to their data. It is biometrics, it is biometric delivery, or no food entitlements, no employment guarantees, nothing. And for the level of biometric penetration that was already present when this book, while this book was written. It's a good question, while, because one can say it has data from 2010, so one can say that it is 14 years old, but despite the fact that it wasn't 14 years in the writing. I think informational injustice, I'll make a brief digression here so that after this we can open to the discussion. Informational injustice, I would also like to highlight, the book doesn't only rely on my work, like I say, is a book that relies on being in the world of digital ID. So one of the cases featured in chapter 5 here is from our colleague Margit Cheeseman, who studies a blockchain for development, development in a way, project. So she studies a cash for work scheme for Syrian refugees in Jordan, and she found that essentially cash was initially given in envelopes and is now given through still biometric but eye scans of people, again with the logic of like recognizing the person and giving the person the right salary. But what she found in her research is that in the receipt that is given to mainly women who work on this program, a lot of the information that was there in the cash envelope is lost. Because women will get a receipt that says, okay, so this is how much cash you can withdraw today, but it doesn't say for which days, for which work the days, how much cash remains which days have been calculated. So it's very key information that is lost in the transition to biometric. And I think it's really epitomic of informational injustice. There's one more layer, and then, as I promised you, a happy conclusion. In this layer called design-related injustice. Why so? Because I think when we were doing the work with my co-author on the public distribution system, we really saw design injustice as the technology not being designed for the person. So, for example, in the case of India's public distribution system, technology is very ready to exclude the non-entitled. But for the millions of families that are still not recognized biometrically, and still there is a problem, because there is, at least in the States, I keep underlining this, sorry, but at least in the States where I work, there is not really a mechanism to bypass the machine's exclusion. The book makes one step further, essentially relies a lot on the work on the splendid book Design Justice by Sasha Costanza Schock, amazing book, highly recommended, and sees design injustice as something scripted into the technology, something inscribed in the technology itself. So, for example, a technology that is built in order to exclude the non-entitled. Is not, I work in an information systems department, no? Very social information systems. I'm not the tech side. And in my field, Caroline might agree here or not, that we use a lot this expression, dark side of technology. But what I'm saying here is that it's not a side. At maximum, it is the matter of the technology. It's not a side. It is designed to produce certain problems. So that's the sort of framework that the book develops. I want to end on a positive note. Promised you, no? Happy conclusion. On this note of building fair ID. So there is one operation that I do at the end of the book, and I think I can be very open-hearted here and say I hope it will inspire a sequel. Doesn't have an editor yet, so if you know an editor, we'll talk over coffee later. Yeah, so I do something at the end of the book, which is taking another concept, so it's data justice to examine unfairness, and it's data activism to examine ways to build fairer forms of ID. So on the data activism topic, I use a lot the concept of my friend and co-author Stefania Milan from the University of Amsterdam and Lonneke van der Velden. So they see data activism very much as this way to a socio-technical, no? So the fusion of the data part of activism and the social component of it. And data activism, the reason I find it particularly powerful to conceptualize resistance to unfair ID is that it has two main components. There is a reactive component, which I think is perhaps the most researched. So all the techniques of resistance that we have, so for example, when we resist to forms of surveillance, when we your work on advocacy on against unjust forms of surveillance, so reaction, okay. But there is, and I think it's even more important, a proactive vision of data activism. So what is proactive data activism? Is actually seeking alternatives, is actually working together to imagine alternatives. I want to end this mini presentation with a happy story. So one of the cases featured, I think, in chapter 7, but also chapter 4 of my book, is the case of Kenya's double registration. Anyone from Kenya? Nobody? So try my best to briefly do justice to the situation. Essentially, Kenya has a systemic situation in which people have been over the years, so Kenyan nationals have been over the years registered as refugees, while not being technically refugees, for very dire needs, because there were many moments in which delivery of food, delivery of aid, education were possible in refugee camps. For example, in the moments where a very bad drought affected northern Kenya. Same people try to access a digital identity card and they can't because they are registered as refugees. So the biometric database of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees shared with the Central ID Authority makes it impossible to release cards to the victims of double registration. It is of 1 week ago. I remember I was scrolling. I think we can all agree these are very sad times for the world and particularly for some countries. So I was not really looking for a ray of light. And I think it was I don't know if it was my LinkedIn or my Blue Sky, like informing that one of the organizations cited in this book is called Haki na Sharia, means justice and freedom in the Swahili language. I hope I'm right. Haki na Sharia, or maybe it's freedom and justice. I'm sorry, my Swahili is really bad. Freedom and justice. So but essentially, yeah, what they managed to do was to make sure that an order is passed that victims of double registration will receive an identity card. So there's a lot of action in between this decision of the Supreme Court of Kenya and what will actually happen, but that's a victory. It didn't happen when I was writing this book, but it's a very good example of proactive data activism. So that's the hint to hope I mentioned. I think this is the end of it. This is a brief summary, maybe. I want to conclude with this idea of the data flash. So digital identity systems have a very data-based flash. They work with our data. They use data to guarantee or deny essential rights. Is a fair ID possible? We have a good hour to discuss whether a fair ID is possible. My message, my take is that it is. I want to be positive. I try to be a positive person, even it's a very difficult time to be a positive person. But yeah, however, I think it is possible if we make a scientific effort to understand injustice, which is what, again, my book seeks to do with its data justice framework. So yeah, fair ID possible, okay. If we commit to systematically not making the same errors we made and to systematically study how injustice is produced. So I want to end on this happy note. Big thanks, and look forward to its discussion and to hearing your ideas on the book, but big thanks again.
Thank you. So thank you, Silvia. And we're going to just pass straight over to Eve to respond.
Fantastic. Is the mic working? Yeah. Okay, so huge thank you then to Tony for the invitation to be here today, as well as obviously to our star of the day, Silvia, for such a fantastic book. And I think as she's highlighting, we're living in very exciting but also highly uncertain times. Now, debates on digital identity have been brewing for a number of years. And what I think Silvia does extremely well with her contribution is that she's tying a lot of this research and these stories together. So what we've seen a lot of great activists, researchers, people working in international development, and communities themselves, right, saying we are having problems. There are a lot of people, certainly within our circle of researchers and grassroots groups, who are producing the empirical evidence that is flying in the face of a lot of the claims of some of the major international organizations, such as the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and many others. And so I think what Silvia's done really well is she's managed to draw on this evidence, draw on these lived experiences, look at the country case studies. To name a few, I know that you speak about, for example, you mentioned in your book, you talk about Uganda, you talk about Jordan, you talk about what's happening with the Rohingya, you're talking about bordering practices in Kenya, and my work in the Dominican Republic and a lot of other places. So it's super important, I think, just the major point of what you're doing is to say, we have a problem, right? We have a problem and we need to accept that something is going on here, because at the until very recently, or until now, even ongoing, is that these problems are not being discussed, right? They're being we're kind of like seeing this kind of gaslighting, right, that's happening. We're saying, okay, well, if we redesign the system, or if we redesign a program, or if we look at it again, it'll be fine and we'll sort it. There's something much deeper going on. So what... yeah, and those of us who've been shouting then about this topic really quite loudly with our warnings and critiques and concerns, as well as with facts and reports and evidence, is that we're starting to highlight some of the serious failings that digital architectures have been have been producing, right? And this is so important because these digital architectures are now underpinning social protection, right? So we're coming at this, so although we're coming at it all from very different perspectives, from different disciplines, I myself work in a history department. I know Silvia's background was it in technology or?
It's an information system,
Yeah.
which is technology.
I know Tony's background is in that. In
International
development. So we're all coming at this from very different perspectives, but we're all identifying the same shared problem, right? And I think that that's super powerful then. And this is what Silvia does brilliantly when she observes that people writing on digital ID are, you know, are kind of highlighting this, and are oftentimes, I said this was right at the end, but it kind of struck with me. Many of us are early career and junior researchers, right? And it feels like a bit of a David and Goliath situation emerging, where you've got a group of scholars who are carrying out some really necessary research, where at the same time there's and trying to forge like a serious discussion with senior academics, senior people in industry, with governments, with people working on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, etc., to say, listen, we need to frame this differently, I think. And I think a lot of the discussions we certainly find in international circles are the way that these kind of agendas are shaped and the way that these questions are framed don't allow for critique of this issue, and there needs to be critique, because it's only, I think you said very, very importantly just now, it's not universal anymore. It becomes conditional depending on the ID one can produce. And wherever there is a very prominent sociologist once said to me, and this kind of shows the interdisciplinarity of the subject, but once said to me that wherever you find inclusion, there will inevitably always be some element of exclusion. And I think that acceptance is super important when thinking about digital identification systems, and particularly when thinking about working with marginalized groups, vulnerable groups, racialized groups, how certain systems that are saying that they're including certain groups can also be used as tools for exclusion and for nefarious purposes. So the debate then is highly polarized, right? There's those who are very much in favor of digitization and ensuring that every living person on this planet has their ID. And remember, I have to say, you know, working in a history department, that this is only very recent. It's only in the last 2 to 3 decades that we've moved from paper-based systems to digital systems, right? And the vast majority of the world had no form of ID whatsoever, no birth certificate, no form of formal identification. So we've really seen an enormous shift from not just insisting that children have their birth certificate or that people have some form of ID, but that this has all become digitized very quickly. It's been brought in very quickly in areas, in many scenarios where, you know, there just isn't that baseline infrastructure to actually address this. So there are those on the other side of the fence then who see this as who warn of a diabolical dystopian existence that we're all hurtling towards. And I think what Silvia's book does helpfully then is find some middle ground with this, right? Find some middle ground for actually some productive discussion rather than kind of seeing this issue in such a polarized way. So for those who support digital systems, this thinking, the thinking of it, and I would say, as particularly in the international development sector, perhaps I'm talking to the wrong crowd, I might be booed in a minute, but it really aligns very closely with neoliberal logic and that of the global market, right? Turning the individuals, and particularly the income poor and the most vulnerable, into customers, into consumers, into people who are traceable and trackable. And that in itself for me was like the warning sign that this was going to be very problematic. So by having a digital existence, this has a value to the market, right? It's no surprise that not just the tech sector and not just governments in the international development sector, but also the finance sector, so Visa International, major banks, have invested very heavily in these programs. So as the book explains really well, the logic underpinning this position is that IDs unlock rights. So if we know who everyone is, if we know where they are, if we know what they're doing, who their families are, what their heritage is, then this will inevitably unlock access to all sorts of wonderful rights and services as the narrative goes. And many of us have produced evidence that show that that is not precisely the way that this kind of dream is playing out. And so this conversation has taken a whole new path when applied to the development sector, because when we're talking about digital public infrastructures, what my work itself evidences is how the welfare state, in particular, so how the construct of the welfare state and the rollout of kind of cash transfer payments to the very poorest can also be kind of weaponized, right? How welfare systems can be weaponized to exclude undesirable groups. In my case, it was Haitian descended people who were born and living in the Dominican Republic who already had their Dominican ID cards. So we hear a lot then of the language of human rights, equality, accessibility, universalism, democracy, inclusion. This is all wrapped up right in the current discourse on digital identity. So you have those of us, and I think Silvia would, and I agree, and possibly Tony, lean to more towards a position where we're speaking with communities, we're dissecting policy, we're incorporating cultural and historical viewpoints, and we're asking if the claims of the tech sector, the development sector, governments and private industry are matching up with the lived experiences on the ground. And is this discourse of inclusion for all really claiming what it's claiming to do? And it's as I've said, the debate is we have the naysayers and we have those championing digital ID and biometrics, and then in addition to the more diplomatic people who are still observing from the sidelines. And I think, and this is pulling it all back to what Silvia was talking about then, what's important is this ecosystem, this grouping of all these different entities, different people, different stakeholders, people with different interests and experiences are still not talking to each other. They're still not in the room having a serious discussion together. And that's the main achievement then of what Silvia has done. She's brought these people together, she brought this literature together, these viewpoints together, and put them in discussion with one another. And I think you do very well. I think it's super important to mention the work of Karen Weisberg, because you mentioned her bordering practices in Kenya, Natalie Brinham as well, Bronwyn Mamby, Margie Chesman, Lynette Taylor. There are many more who have really influenced a lot of my own work, of your work, and I think the field more generally as well. So I said I'd keep it brief. I tried. So I am in your book. You say, on page 61, you say, while exclusions of entitled users are largely framed as a side effect, they're directly produced by how the technology is designed. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about the design of these technologies and why the identification of problems within these systems does not always necessarily lead to solutions for all users. Thank you.
So first of all, big thanks. I mean, I was emotional before, now I'm more emotional after. I think before I even begin, can I give a brief story of how we met each other? It's I think we met in a workshop in Cambridge, but we didn't a workshop of the digital ID world, but we didn't have the occasion to chat much because I got a massive fever on day one, and that's where I lost all the.
But also thank you to Bronwyn Mamby, because she brought me to that conference as well, and she's been a real inspiration. Yeah. And
excellent that you mentioned her work, because also her work, exactly like you say, Dave, really influenced the whole idea of unfair ID. And she's been a massive source when it comes to human rights and the legal side that, like I said, is not my expertise. So it was a lot of study. But I think that at a point we met during lockdown, because I had your book on my desk, and I think we had a Zoom aperitivo or so, and I'm like, oh, mama, this fun moment, like, oh, mama, I really like this book. And then what we found in common is very much, and I think I'm going to quote what you just say, like recognizing that we have a problem and dissecting it scientifically. That's different, context, a data justice lens, and yours is an in-depth ethnographic work on the Dominican Republic, but the mission is the same, I would say. And now on your question on design, so I think in a way design and justice is the bottom of the iceberg. Do we say bottom of the iceberg? Tip. But the tip is not the tip. The other thing, what is below?
The underside, beneath the iceberg, beneath.
Yeah, because I know in Italian, but I wouldn't know in English. But it's okay, the beneath of the iceberg, because I think with design injustice, we really see like how technology can be purposefully applied, not necessarily because one wakes up and say, today I'm gonna do harm. but to be purposefully applied in ways that exclude systematically. I think I'm going to use an example from the book that inspired chapter 6, and that's again Design Justice by Sasha Costanza Schock. So Costanza Schock approaches the problem from a queer and trans perspective. She studies, among other things, airport scanners that recognize a default body, a male or a female body, and automatically flag a non-conform body, for example, a female transgender body, as non-conform, and then as flagged. Now, this is not an accident. It's not like one say, oh, vabbè, but technology, vabbè, but it's a side problem. It's not a side. It is how the technology is designed that makes the body non-recognizable, non-recognizable as conform and hence flaggable. So yeah, hugely recommended book. I think when I do these book presentations, one of the main things I do is recommend other books. but yeah, so I guess this goes to the heart of the idea of tech being designed. Another thing I love doing when I do book presentations is showcase my colleagues' work. Tony, you just published a paper on the journal where I'm also editor-in-chief, IT for Development, that is a literature review on digital authoritarianism. So it's, I think what I read in your paper is also that in many of the technologies, so that your literature review covers, I really see this design injustice problem, because it's not like these technologies incidentally relate to authoritarianism. It's a very purposeful, I don't know, maybe you can briefly comment on this, because it really came to my mind with this question.
Yeah, so in fact, I was going to ask you a question about exactly that, but just to flag to the audience, I'm just going to ask one or two more questions, and then I'm coming to you for your questions, and if there are any questions online. But I also wanted to pick up on that point about whether this designed injustice is a feature or a bug. Is it designed in from the outset or not? Because we, on a day-to-day basis, we work with all sorts of people in different agencies who are good people trying to do good things and design good systems. However, whenever we do deep empirical investigation of specific systems in empirical context, we always find that the use of digital excludes. And so the question, I don't know if it's your question for me or my question for you, is why? What's happening there? What is it about the use of digital technology that leads to designed or undesigned exclusion and discrimination?
Yeah, I love difficult questions because they invite us to reflect, and it also connects to the stream of design justice thinking that Eve introduced before. I think a lot that is in digital technology is not necessarily digital. I think one of the things I try to do in even chapter 2 tries to review the literature on the topic. Difficult mission, because good luck reviewing the literature on digital identities. One thing I love of the digital ID community is that we are, aren't we, so diverse? We are so like different streams. We are lawyers, we are techies, we are me that I'm not clear what I am, because it's the development studies with a flavor of IT. But what we have in common is very much this mission of understanding what the problem is. And a lot of the problem is not digital. So this connects to your question as well. So a lot of the problem that we see in digital identity, for example, you mentioned the work of Karen Weisberg. Karen works, among other issues, on the double registration problem that we mentioned. And also Karen has a splendid book, which is titled We Do Not Have Borders, and takes a historical perspective on Kenya and Somalia. And one of the things she shows is that a lot of the design problems are not digital. So it takes a historical perspective that comes from a lot before identity was digitized. It goes into colonial Kenya, it goes into like the shaping of identities, the heteronormative, so externally directed shaping of identity. So my take on your question, Tony, is that the digital reifies many things, like consolidates type of injustice that in many cases, and that's and I would strongly say that's the same case for your work, Eve. At least that's my reading of your book. Yes, the digital consolidates a lot, but you take a strong historical perspective on people of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic since a lot before this was digital. So yes, it is digital, but a lot of what the digital does is to enact things that in many ways were there before. It is also, other positive note, that is also one of the reasons why we can use the digital to introduce processes of proactive data activism. I think the victory of the Haki no Sharia organization on the double registration case is beautifully epitomic on this. So yeah, other positive note.
So another thing that often goes under the radar in all of these discussions is the role of the private sector. And we often think of digital ID as being about the relationship between the state on the one hand and the citizen on the other. But as we look across all of these initiatives, more and more we're seeing private sector actors taking the lead, whether that's MasterCard or Visa or other organizations. So in your research, did that issue come up, and do you think it's making a difference?
I think it's super important to talk private sector, and I don't really think one can do, one can talk about ID without talking of private sector, because after all, someone manufactures these technologies. It is only extremely difficult to research. I think one of the reasons is that, no, I don't think it's controversial to say it's not really easy to talk to. Especially when you write a book called Unfair ID, but there can be some incidental cause there. The book tries to engage private sector, not on primary data, which I don't have, but in trying to map how the private sector seeks to participate in the ID landscape. There is a great recent report by Access Now, written by Giulio Coppi, that does exactly this. I think it's called Mapping Tech Humanitarianism, and it looks at which actors are involved and how. Another forum where this is largely studied is called ID for Africa. It is featured, I've never been there, but it is featured in the book based on secondary data. And ID for Africa is essentially a big forum in which many private sector companies, many of whom essentially buy each other, because it is, well, there are a few giants. It's very often the same names. One can say Thales, one can say IDEMIA, one can say Gemalto, that was bought by Thales. Essentially is companies that present technologies, and governments, predominantly Africa, so African governments, attending occasions and potentially coming home with a new biometric system, one can say. So yeah, that's I never attended that forum. Branwen did, Karen did. I think I last met them when we were in South Africa for another conference. That's one of the let's say physical grounds where these issues can be examined. So again, long answer to say, in Unfair ID I can only do that on secondary data. But again, the work of Access Now, the work of Weisberg, Mambi, Emrys, Shoemaker is very focused on these things.
Okay, my last question, and to try and make a link to digital public infrastructure. Your research started off with kind of physical supply of food, and is more recently focused on digital ID itself. But we're seeing digital ID linked to cash payments and to data transfers. How does your research read those changes on a week where digital public infrastructure in the US has been
it's a very timely question, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say sadly timely, but sadly timely. Yeah, so I think the story that I tell here, so in the story, there are several, but the India story I tell here is that, again, like you said, of a food distribution system. However, it is a food distribution system that at many times has been sought, different governments, including the current one, have sought to transform in a cash system. Actually, there are 3 states in which, including Delhi, in which a cash system in lieu of food rations has been piloted. Now, when in the last round of, it wasn't the last, but the last one featured in this book that we did on this program, we actually asked a question to people. So would you prefer a cash alternative? And there is an Indian economist, Ritika Khera, who actually has a whole stream of work on food versus cash. I tell here them, Southern Indian version of the story based on my data. The people I spoke to don't want a cash system, to put it very bluntly, for many reasons. The main reason they gave us when we did our fieldwork is that in practice, maybe the ration doesn't always come, maybe the ration dealer tampers a little bit with the scale, maybe 1 month, oops, rice has magically disappeared, but at least it is food on the table. Whereas with cash is all a lot more uncertain. So it's we had other reasons for people to be like fearful, not only skeptical, it was fearful about cash. I think there is, it wasn't featured so prominently the fact that cash will not necessarily go into food, that in the literature is one of the most prominent, no? So if there is sadly a literature on male house heads that don't necessarily use the cash to buy food. It did come up in our fieldwork, not so much. The main reason was uncertainty. So like the people, at least I spoke to, don't want cash. So it's, and it would be interesting to think, if I'm allowed another sad note, then I promise that we speak about happy things. The type of fieldwork I do has become very difficult to do. And colleagues with an India focus in the room will probably see why. It was already difficult before, it wasn't easy. But it is not a political climate in which these are easy questions to ask.
Okay, so we are opening the floor to questions. And also if there are any questions online here. To you.
Do we pass the mic? Okay, thank you.
I'm Abhinaya. I'm doing the Masters in Development Studies here at IDS. Firstly, thank you for the overview about your book. It was very interesting. I can't wait to get my hands on it. So expect an email from me about requesting a PDF.
Please.
So I was recently reading up a lot about the Aadhaar and how it's interlinked with other sort of public goods and services in India. And my conclusion wasn't half as optimistic as yours. So I was wondering if, firstly, why there is so much uptake of biometric based digital IDs in the world. Like, for example, when there was something the government said about how there was a massive percolation of the Aadhaar in India, and then there were other countries that wanted to sort of replicate the success in quotes. So if there are, and if we know that there are exclusionary patterns that are aggravated because of these sort of IDs, should we just do away with them? Are we not doing away with them because we can't conceive any alternatives? Also, given that they don't account for any sort of migration and they are rooted within a specific physical address and they're non-transferable between those addresses unless you go through, again, a very bureaucratic and lengthy process to do it. So yeah, that was my long question.
Do you want to take more questions or should I go answer one by one?
The other person disappeared. Oh, Chris.
Sorry. My question is quite linked to that. It's about looking at the India case. And I just wondered if you can tell us a little bit more about the more recent developments with the one card, one nation and what that's done. And I was just wondering, is that something that has possibly increased these forms of injustice, or would you take a more optimistic view that some forms of exclusion have actually been reduced through the one card, one nation? So yeah, that's linked, I think.
Any other questions? Over here.
You got me busy now.
Thanks, by the way.
Where am I going? Who am I going to?
So these are the digital public industry.
Yeah, so my question was also related to the redesign concept and design injustice specifically. And it just was making me think, and if you could speak to it a bit more broadly about like how easy is it to redesign? Like, what are the conditions that facilitate, and then what are the conditions that will block it? So even though you identify and acknowledge a problem, when we're talking about these systems being put in place, what conditions actually encourage actual redesign versus block it, and what have you seen in practice?
You want one more, Tony? Or
Yeah.
okay.
I'm taking notes.
All right. So I'm not a digital ID expert at all, so my question might be a bit like basic. But I was thinking, so governments have, I'm from South Africa, where we have a national ID number, and it's linked to like SARS, the tax authority. It's linked to if you want to get a driver's license or a new passport, you're kind of always using your ID number that's assigned to you when you're born. And it's not a digital ID in the sense that it's not biometric, as far as I like understand how digital ID has been conceptualized as, like, you know, you've got your you can scan a retina or something, and it's like all your details pop up. Or in the UK, you have various different numbers that identify you vis-a-vis the government. It's not unified, but you might have national insurance number for one thing and your HMRC number for another thing, something like this. What makes digital ID especially unique and risky in the way that you've like thought about these injustices and resistances that is different to how we have been identifying citizens without these biometric systems that are are like how you've described them? But I'm not sure my question's like clear in my
Very
mind,
clear.
but yeah.
Okay, we
Think about one more. Should I take this round and another round? You tell me. Yes.
It's adding to this, like, so taking the historical perspective, right? Like a lot of these, to me, like reminds the constant effort of states to make society legible, right? This has been going on for a very long period of time. It's connected to extraction, or desire of the state to take something away and reorganize. How much of this recent drive is connected to the private sector? Like, you know, how much that push in this particular way, and not the private sector, but as you mentioned, a very limited number of companies that come from a very specific place in the world. And would it be different if the private sector that was moving all of these were not originating from, you know, particular part of the global north? Could you imagine a situation where, you know, an Uganda-based company would do things very differently? And are there differences between countries in which this digital ID drive has a strong private sector component and those in which this component is not there?
Okay, so we're going to give Silvia a chance to respond, and then I can see at least 2, maybe 3 other questions we'll take in the next round.
Okay, so we will do rounds of questions, I think. Am I right that we are till 5:30?
Yeah.
And coffee time or something stronger after? So yeah. So big thanks. I think is like one. Just for full disclosure, this is the second UK presentation of this book tour, so everything is very new to me. Like, when you presented papers all your lives and then it's a book, you think, hey, but it's like a longer paper. No, different things. So it's so big thanks for the engagement and the questions. I'll begin with the one the question about the spread of I can say Aadhaar modeled digital ID systems in the world. And you are very right. It is something I think that the conferences that even I go to often recognize a lot. I think you had both a why and a what can we do part of the question. I think the why would it's intellectually beautifully challenging. The why. I think one of the reasons is that well, today we again our work is brought together by the fact of recognizing that there is a problem. I'll cite again the report by the NYU Center, essentially documenting that benefits, there is evidence of benefits scattered, scattered and thin to this day. I was in Oxford with one of the co-authors of the report 2 days ago. It remains scattered. Whereas evidence of harm, I think that report makes a particularly good job of evidence across countries. So why are systems reproduced? I think one interpretation is that while evidence of benefits is what it is, the way it is proposed, the way it is presented, so the orthodoxy of ID for development is very clearly articulated. It is articulated, well, the World Bank as a whole initiative, ID for development, it is articulated in public forums, it is articulated across sectors, and it is very much Aadhaar based. So it's, yes, the second part of the question was, should we not just do away with them? I think working like in a logic of penetration of infrastructure, I think the doability of the doing away with them, can I say, is sadly limited. But one thing we can do is, I think one thing we can do is, again, like work on systems, work on systems to understand systematically where the problem is. One way to do that, data protection impact assessments or data harm impact assessments is again the legal field, which is not mine, but relying again on the work of Access Now, among one, and Privacy International, I should have mentioned, they are based in London. Much can be done. Grace, you asked about One Nation, One Ration card. A big surprise in the room. You know that I don't know much about it because that was past my last round of work, but to my best understanding, One Nation, One Ration card. So the situation now is that the ration card that is needed to collect rations, it is historically state-based, and India has 29 states and 7 special territories. So One Nation, One Ration card, it means I have one ration card, I can collect goods in all states. So that's the theme of portability. Or for instance, if I find out that my ration dealer is tampering a bit with quantities, I can go to another ration dealer. I think that's the philosophy. I sadly don't have data, but maybe we can talk later because there is something that we just said even with here that I would be very interested in seeing if there are empirical studies. Because a lot of something I don't do is econometrics, and econometrics does plenty in illustrating, for example, when there is a spike of exclusion. I mentioned the work of Ritika Khera, but there is not only her, right? There is also, for example, the work of Karthik Muralidharan. There was that question on how easy it is to redesign. And then, if I understand correctly your question, like what are the pros of redesigning versus blocking? I think it's like for what I could see, I'm gonna give an India-based response again. I started doing this research when there was very little biometrics in the PDS, in the public distribution system. My PhD, time flies, 11 years ago, and my fieldwork was 14 years ago. Much was not digital. And there was a lot of redesigning at the state level. For example, Kerala, one of the states where I worked, essentially redesigned the food distribution system in a way that, for example, monitored the allocation of goods to ration shops. There is an organization called Right to Food India that does a lot of the activism that we mentioned. And they study ways in which this can be done virtuously, for example, with electronic weighing machines, so the person knows how much is being sold. So I can say redesign is possible. I find it a lot harder when it is bigger infrastructures because that essentially determines the functioning of a system for very big like populations. But I think redesign in many ways is one of the reasons why I want a second book, because I only don't have enough data, but I think it really can be one way. And then you asked, yes, in terms of, so how much is like the drive connect to the private sector, and in terms, and I think it's a very good question, what is special on digital ID? So what makes it especially unique, and as we saw, especially risky? I think what makes it especially risky is what we mentioned like before, that the digital reifies, the digital makes existing processes extremely concrete. Yves' book again, so I think them in many cases in your research, people were unable to renew their identity, but they had, no?
Yeah, they would. Their ID cards were null and void, and their citizenship was null and void, and they were told effectively that their ID cards had been issued in error and that their nationality was incorrect. Yeah.
So essentially, it was.
And this is not just in the Dominican Republic, right? We're seeing this in other parts of the world as well.
I would say that the Kenya case has sadly strong parallels here. To name one, to name one. So in terms, I think that's one of the uniqueness markers is how much the digital reifies and makes it difficult to come back to how things were before. When I was studying earlier versions of the public distribution system, the ration dealer had a copybook that, okay, machine didn't work, okay, I know who you are, I'll give you the ration. They can't do so now because it's like the transaction is enabled, so that. And in terms of the private sector, I think you raise a very important point. Is like, yeah, many of these actors are in a very specific part of the world. Not all of them. I think, for example, in the Indian case, I mean, I forgot to mention the little detail that Aadhaar's founder, Nandan Nilekani, was at the time the chairman of Infosys, that is one of the big tech giants. So, and one can say, well, but it wasn't tech import. It was locally created technology. So, yeah, okay. When it comes, however, to forum like ID for Africa, there is a very clear demarcation. So I think it says a lot about the discourse and a lot about I think like fellow digital ID researcher may agree or disagree here. It is one of the reasons why it's so hard to bring the private sector into the room. In my case, impossible. At 15 years, I do this research. Oh, I tried. For some reason, they don't want to talk to me. But tried. It's not like I didn't try. As we say in Italian, no. What is that in English? No harm in trying. Yes.
Okay. Shall we take 2 more questions?
Hi, yeah, I'm Isaac. I'm a public health advisor, and yeah, so yeah, thanks for the presentation. And I just want to touch on a few things, but I want to come from the public health perspective because I'm more into public health. I realize one of the challenges that we're having with the digital outcome is kind of informational injustice. And looking at the COVID-19 response, for example, realized a lot of data was taken. A lot of data were taken from people. Even in Africa, we have a whole system taking information on the identity of the person, and also another system for tracking of the person in terms of contact tracing. So like we have a lot of information or data that has been taken from people during the outbreak period. Let me take the COVID-19 response period. I realize that most of them are not aware of what their data is being used for. Mm-hmm. And now pandemic is over. We are no more using this particular information again. So I want to know, I know one information that you brought out was the data activism. So I want to know from your research, what will be the impact for data activism when it comes to the information that has been collected during this particular period? Because we know a lot of private sector came in during the COVID-19 response. A lot of people came up with a lot of information system to collect data. I know some part of Africa, we have these, let me use Ghana as an example. We know they have the Ghana card now, which is kind of ID to track each person. So they took all this information from people. I want to know what is the future in terms of data activism. How are we going to make sure that the people are aware of what the information is going to be used now the COVID-19 pandemic is over? I don't know whether it's clear.
And the other gent over here.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for presentation. And my question is, as my understanding, in your book, you discussed ongoing cases in area or country where institution is kind of weak, but maybe this is a little bit far away from the main discussion, but you also have cases of digitalization, like a digital ID of country where institution is strong. Maybe probably like Norway has already introduced digital ID. And do you still find injustice in cases of strong institution country, or do you think in strong institution country they do well? I mean, I am from Japan. Now Japan is on process of introducing digital ID. So, and I'm just concerned of future of my country. That is the reason of my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Should I take this too?
Yeah, if you don't mind, we're going to take one question from the internet as well.
Yes, please.
Thank you. We have a question from a student in IIT Madras, India. I've been doing some research related to digital exclusion in India, especially with regard to social identities like women and the elderly. In India, there are many problems which arise from the fact marginalized identities do not have access to the apparatus that enable them to be participants in the digital economy. How does the problem related to digital ID manifest with regard to these identities particularly? Do you notice any intersections in this regard?
Marginalized identity. Yes, big thanks. Should I take this three? First question. Isaac, did we do a project together 2 years ago?
Yeah.
That's you. That's why. Why did I see you? So happy you came. Thank you. I didn't know you were in Sussex. So good to see you again. So COVID-19. I was trying to put where did I meet Isaac? Yeah, and we did a project on tracing COVID-19 pandemic. I think on this, first of all, sorry, I keep shooting book recommendations, but there is a splendid book called Data Justice and COVID-19 Global Perspectives, and that's by Lynette Taylor, whose framework I use, and Aaron Martin, Gargi Sharma, and Shad Jameson. So it's called Data Justice and COVID-19 Global Perspective. It's an open access book, and I think it's the best answer to your question, Isaac. So what's the future now that COVID-19 tracing is not that much in place anymore? What the book does is that it takes 33 cases, I'm fairly sure that's the number, of country cases of COVID-19 tracing systems that didn't go too well, essentially, especially when it comes to privacy and data protection. And it takes the perspective, it also links to the question from the online of marginalized communities. So for example, there are chapters on tracing queer and trans communities, chapters on below poverty line people. So I wouldn't be able to say what the future is, but what we are seeing and what the book does is it really studies the public-private partnership that COVID-19 has reified even more. And again, I think my best source, my most up-to-date source on private sector involvement in digital ID is the Access Now report that I just cited by Giulio Coppi, 2024. But yeah, I think what the pandemic enabled is a lot of public-private partnerships that the Taylor et al. Book traces really well. So it's not a happy answer, but yes, I think you make a very good point on countries with stronger institutions potentially struggling with ID. I live in Norway, and my next project is on Norway. We have a digital, I can say like short anecdote, but when I moved to Norway, I think in my 3rd month there, I had an eye incident and needed urgent medical care, and they were like, no problem. Allora, so you are this number, they knew where I lived, they knew, okay, so we can send you an ambulance at, like, okay, you know a lot of things. Then went to the pharmacy, collected my medications, and I told them my number, my Norwegian Aadhaar, put it this way, and they had my prescription, and they had, sounds familiar, no? And they had, basically they already knew everything. I'm like, wow, you know a lot of things. The question is, I think I'm not in the position to discuss the privacy protection side. There is substantial research on the privacy protection side, like my colleague Kristin Bergtura Sandvik, that studies the extent to which data are really protected. But I guess the gist of my response is strong institutions do not defend you against unfair ID. Like it's, for example, in Norway, one of the reasons I got the seed funding to study this project is that Norway, one can say strong institutions, not everyone is equally protected. For example, not being a Norwegian national doesn't put everyone on the same place in receiving a digital ID. It's many factors come into play, like the status of the person, whether they're there permanently, the type of visa, many things come into play. So I think research and even the World Bank sorry, not World Bank, the New York University report that we mentioned, like covers how many? Over 70 countries, no? The report by Caitlin and the others.
Yeah, we contributed.
That one, 70 something, not countries that it covers.
A good number.
It was many. I can't remember the number, but mainly not with strong institutions. So I think like seeing how things work, I think I might turn the question to you because I don't know how this country is doing these days, ID-wise. But yeah, I would be surprised if there was no problem, put it this way. And the question from the online, big thanks to the person from IIT Madras. And that was a question on marginalized, if I understood your question correctly, on marginalization inscribed in ID. I think I take an intersectional view of marginalization. So there are many different forms of power that intersect when digital ID is produced. I think I'll make the same example as an Italian woman living in Norway, it is different systems with a permanent job, but different systems are together, like a person without a permanent job, a person in a fragile economic position, a person belonging to any form of targeted group will find themselves in a different position. So I think I take an intersectional view of marginalization, and the most up-to-date data I have on India these days are not primary because my research, like my last round of research was in 2020. But yes, again, to person from online, let's be in touch because I'd love, you mentioned you research these things. I'd love to hear your findings.
Great. So we have Eve as respondent, and so we're going to give her a chance to comment on some of the questions that you've raised. Before taking this to the bar for the next hour, we'll carry on the conversation downstairs. So Eve.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being so accommodating with my lovely daughter who has just gone a bit crazy. I think it's super fascinating questions as well, and really great responses. I think it's important that we backtrack slightly because but my initial interest in this was looking at legal identity, right? And legal identity is a fundamental component, which Silvia does talk about as well in her book of the Sustainable Development Goals 16.9, which aim to provide a legal identity for all by 2030. And a key motivation of that initially was a discussion around, as I said earlier, around birth certificates, right? It's really important to know who people are, who their parents are, because that way they can unlock rights and everything will be great because they'll be able to show, that they are who they say they are. But this has morphed, this entire situation has morphed into, very quickly since the 1990s, a discussion on digital ID, right? On the fact that actually we need to have everyone on a computer database, we need to have people's data, we need to ensure that that our government systems are speaking to one another. We need to ensure that everybody has a unique identifier number so we know that they are who they say they are. And I haven't seen anything satisfactory yet that's actually explained how on earth that happened. And I think there are some very dark interests right behind something that initially was, I think, probably quite an innocent request by some of our older colleagues to, or motivation for them to ensure that children were ID'd, right? So that was something that was very much part of Plan International, UNICEF, and very much part of the development sector. And it made sense because when you think about vital statistics, right, the idea is everybody, we can count them, and that's brilliant when you respond to your donors, because what you say is, you said we had a target of registering 10,000 babies or giving 10,000 babies birth certificates, and we've done it. Look, tick tick tick, we've done it. And this has become something very different. And even in the time that I wrote the book and did the research, so I was talking about legal identity because that was the discourse of the development sector. That was what the World Bank was funding. I was tracing World Bank projects. And it's become, and in my final chapter, I'm sorry, I'm talking about my book, but I think what works really well in chapter 6 is it links into what Silvia's doing, right? Because chapter 6 said, what is going on with these digital systems? When suddenly do we start talking about biometrics and, you know, but of our citizens, right? Biometrics of our citizens, not about something that was applied to cross borders or to foreigners or to people who were migrants, right? We're now applying those same systems and logics within states. And I think that's something super fascinating, and was something that always concerned me. Now, the question about Norway is fantastic because, of course, Norway is the social welfare model. It's kind of seen as the bastion of, like, you know, this is how social protection should be. But again, what those models are mainly pushing is that, and it makes sense, right? If you go to a hospital, then you need to check somebody's immigration status because you need to know if they're renting a property, because you need to know if they're a benefits claimant, right? That might be helpful in the sense that if a state is welcoming, if it's trying to enforce a system of, you know, social protection, but equally you can flick that switch off. This is why I'm terrified about what's happening in the US at the moment, because we always said that what's happening in the Dominican Republic was a testing case, used as a testing ground. We always said that, you know, things that happen as a microcosm, or they happen on a small scale first, for then to see how they can take, you know, much larger impacts. So when we talk about like public digital infrastructures, etc., just as much as systems can be designed to include, they can be designed to exclude and to marginalize. So getting back to what we were saying, and I am wrapping up, Tony, I'm aware I'm talking a lot, but with the Norway example, so yeah, we've seen the Dutch benefit scandal, right, in Holland, which purposely targeted racialized groups and ensured that they weren't able to access the benefits. Switch off. I and my colleagues have just completed a 3-year project. I was on it for 2 years, into the Windrush scandal in the UK. Again, really clear from that what was facilitating people's exclusion was the insistence that they produce a digital existence, right? So the onus was that people who were citizens had to produce a passport, and if they didn't have a passport, they were being told they were being turned away from the NHS, they were being turned away from public services, they were being incarcerated and forcibly removed from the country because they didn't appear in a system as that system demanded, despite being legally settled and residents and citizens of the UK. So these things are happening everywhere, and I think we do need to understand our colonial histories much more, and I think we do need to speak to each other much more, because I feel that this system is very much understood and framed as like a global south, you know, something that's happening in the development arena, right? But this is happening everywhere. So the kind of conspiracy theorists who are talking about cashless economy and all of this stuff, but actually, and the post office scandal, that's another really important example. But actually, this is all important because this is all linked. So my question, if I may, can I ask a question, or I'll wrap up just really quick, or just kind of a rhetorical question? But are we really talking about ID at all? Is it about ID anymore, or is there something much deeper, right? Which I think will be Silvia's second book, so just, you know, to get that in there. But are we talking about ID in itself, or really are we talking about something that's much deeper, much broader, much more embedded within our economy, within the way we're organizing our society, within the way that we're governing you know, literally the world, because these things are universal, they're global, and they're becoming better at communicating with one another.
Thank you. It's worked really well, right? Having the presentation and the discussion, that the conversation has been very rich. I've had to bite my tongue because I have like 100 questions and answers that I want to share. But it's worked really well, and I want to thank our two presenters, Silvia for talking about her book, and Eve for playing the role of the discussant. Let's carry on the conversation in the IDS bar. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to everyone who's online.
Big thanks to the online viewers. Thank you. Yep. Big thanks from me too. Big thanks to the colleagues who attended online. Big thanks to technical assistants.